Hello. All right. So today we are going to answer questions from the VIP list. So this first question I'm going to answer comes from a subscriber who says, quote, I'm in my early 30s, living in the Boston area and planning to invest in real estate, but planning on, I'll paraphrase from this point forward. They're planning on investing in real estate outside of the Boston area because properties in the Boston area are very expensive. So they're thinking about out of state investing. Their question is, how can a new investor find properties that aren't in need of major improvements and will generate cash flow? What is the best way, essentially, what's the best way to go about finding rental properties, particularly out of state? And they also ask, is it better to have a property manager if I don't live in the same area as my properties? They also go on to say that the main reason why they haven't purchased property is because they tend to move fairly often. And currently, given the place where they live, it doesn't make financial sense for them to purchase a primary residence because they live in an area that has a sufficiently high enough a cost of living that it actually makes more sense to rent. Um, so so that's their question is, uh, you know, as a new investor and as somebody who is not just buying their first rental property, but also their first property, the first property ever, what should they do and where should they go? So thank you. So first of all, thank you for the question. And that question, by the way, came from somebody on our VIP list. Join the VIP list and send in your questions. Absolutely zero cost. To answer your question, first of all, um, first I want to commend you on recognizing that the fact that you live in a high cost of living area means that it is in a high cost area. It is often better to rent your primary residence and buy the way that you buy the ideal way, the financially smart way to buy real estate if you live in a high cost of living area is rent your primary residence, rent your personal residence, and buy a rental property out of state. And then over time, once you have enough out of state rental properties, you can actually use the income from those out of state rental properties to offset or even completely cover the cost of your own rent. That's a long-term goal. You're not going to do that with your first property, especially in the first year. But that's what I do. I live in New York City. I live in Manhattan. I am a renter by choice here in Manhattan because I took one look at the price to rent ratios and knew it's much smarter to rent your personal residence in a place like Manhattan. But I have, because I've been investing in real estate for a while, I have enough real estate at this point. I have enough income from my real estate that the income from my real estate can cover the cost of my rent in New York. So the way, the as an inhabitant of a high cost of living area, the approach that I've taken and the approach that I would encourage you to take is continue to rent your primary residence, your personal residence, and start building out a portfolio of properties in very low cost of living areas so that over time, the rent from those properties that are in low cost areas where the price to rent ratios are much healthier and much more landlord friendly, the rent from those properties will pay for the rent that you pay in your own high cost area. So, and you mentioned, by the way, I didn't read this out loud, but you mentioned Indianapolis or the greater Indianapolis area as one of many areas that you're considering. I love Indianapolis. My most recent purchase was a duplex in Indianapolis. I think it's a fantastic place to invest. The chief sanity officer at Afford Anything, Suni, she also invests in Indianapolis. So I am very, very bullish on that market. It is a stable, uh, you know, and let me explain why, because knowing how to think about a place is more important than having an answer, a specific answer. Um, when you're looking for where to invest when it comes to an out of state location, you want to look for an area that has a diversity of industries, right? You don't want an area that is too heavily dependent on just one industry, because if that industry collapses, or worse, if an area is heavily dependent on just one company and that company goes out of business, or if they just pull out their location, that it can decimate housing values and housing demand in that area. So if you look at what happened in Detroit, not today, today Detroit is great, but Detroit in the 1990s, for example, you really saw that effect. If you look at Las Vegas during the pandemic, Vegas had 25% unemployment during the pandemic because it's a pandemic, nobody's going to Vegas, right? And that economy is so heavily dependent on tourism. So much of that economy is entertainment and restaurants and things that people do face to face in person that fortunately Vegas has recovered and it's doing quite well. But it did have that moment during the pandemic where, due to the concentration of risk that came from having a lack of diversity within industries at the industry level, um, that concentrated risk really made Vegas take a hit in 2020 and 2021. So, what I look for when I'm looking for a place to invest is search for a city that has a wide variety of different industries, like Indianapolis, and a wide variety of companies that provide employment. Again, like Indianapolis, Salesforce has an amazing presence there, but it's, even if hypothetically, if Salesforce were to leave, it would, Indianapolis would be fine. If hypothetically the Indy 500 were to go out of business, which knock on wood, it never does, but even if that were to happen, Indianapolis would be fine. It has enough diversity of industries that it can survive even a major upset like that. Um, you also want a place that has a wide enough selection of providers and suppliers that you have an assortment of contractors that you can choose from. You don't want to be in a location that is so small that there's one plumber, there's one HVAC technician, there's one general contractor, right? There's one electrician. You don't want to be in a town that is so small that there's one or two of these service providers, and if you don't like them, or if they're not good, or if they're not available, there's no one else that you can really turn to. So you want a variety of service, a town that's large enough that you have a variety of service providers. You also want a place that is reasonably accessible by at a minimum through a major interstate highway. It doesn't have to be directly on a major interstate highway, but reasonably accessible from it. You don't want something, I know some people who have considered some very, very remote parts of Nevada, for example, right? You look at um, Pahrump, Nevada, and the price to rent ratios there are great, but it is so far away from even a highway that, I think it would be a much better call to invest in a place like Carson City rather than some really, really remote tiny town, in Nevada. And I've kind of alluded to this several times, but of course, the price to rent ratio. Ultimately, price to rent ratio is a big thing that you're going to be thinking about as you're trying to determine where to invest. And so that price to rent ratio is going to be your kind of big picture, broad guiding force as you're picking a location. Um, Now, to your question about how to select a given property, and by the way, in our course in your first rental property, we have um, we have an entire section that's entirely about one of our modules is entirely about how to find properties. And we go through what to look for as you are conducting a property search. Um, but what you said in your email, you're looking for a property that does not need a lot of initial upfront repairs. That's a very, it's good that you've identified that, although I would, if I were talking to you, if this were a two-way conversation, I would want to dig a little bit deeper. I'd want to unpack why you're looking for something that doesn't need major improvements, because often the properties that do need big improvements have really excellent potential in terms of the cost that you can acquire them for, plus the cost of doing the improvement. You get some pretty in some cases, some really impressive equity growth that happens right up front. And the rent that you collect relative to purchase price plus acquisition, so the cap rate, in other words, that the property ultimately generates, ends up being very, very handsome. So there's a lot of uh, if you don't want something that needs major improvements, that's fine. There's a lot of people have that strategy. I just want to unpack that a little bit. But we'll run with what you said. You want something that doesn't need a lot of major improvements. Fantastic. that means you now have important information that you can use as a broad filtering mechanism. But there are also a lot of unanswered questions, like do you want to look for properties that are publicly listed on the MLS? Or do you want to look for properties that are unlisted, that come from driving for dollars, or come from bandit signs, or come from wholesalers, or come from um, forming relationships with other deal makers, and that come from word of mouth, right? There are pros and cons to both approaches. If you look for something that's publicly listed on the MLS, that is the most time-saving approach. It's the easiest approach, but it's also the approach where you're more likely to be buying something at fair market value rather than under market value. And so the way that I think of it, the framework that I use, bear with my on the fly. All right, we're gonna draw a chart here. All right, so wow, I cannot draw a straight line, but bear with me. All right, so we've got effort and reward. All right, look at my beautiful drawing. All right, effort, reward. And so if you think about this as a spectrum, right? As whew, is this blown out? Here, you can see this. There we go. As effort increases, as the level of effort increases, the level of reward typically, or profitability, if you want to phrase it, the level of reward also increases. So there's this that's the relationship between effort and reward. Now, if you think about this, if you overlay how to find a property, right? So buying something that is publicly listed on the MLS, relatively low effort, low reward. Whereas buying something that's, let's say, driving for dollars, or since you would be buying out of state, that would be enlisting an agent or an assistant, enlisting somebody who has boots on the ground to drive for dollars for you, right? Or forming relationships with deal makers, or buying something from wholesalers, right? It's additional effort, but also additional reward. So that's basically how that relationship works. Similarly, that is how it relates to how to find a property. Now let's also layer on the quality of the property that you're buying, right? So if you're buying something that is totally move-in ready, completely move-in ready, it needs absolutely no repairs, it was built in 2012, right? New construction, great neighborhood, class A property, move-in ready, beautiful, mwah, chef's kiss, low effort, relatively lower reward. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you buy something that is a big fixer-upper, higher effort, higher reward. And so what you want to do, the first question that you want to ask yourself is, where along this spectrum do you want to be? And there's no wrong answer. There are people, I answered a question yesterday from a VIP list subscriber whose their biggest concern was the fact that they are incredibly busy, just incredibly, incredibly busy. And so they wanted to know, hey, given the fact that I'm so busy, how do I do any of this? So a person like that, their ideal spot is here on the effort reward spectrum. Whereas if someone has a goal of, hey, I really want to retire in the next 10 years and I want real estate to accelerate my path to that early retirement 10 years from now, well, in that case, if that's your primary driving focus, then you'd want to be up here on the effort reward spectrum. So based on either your boundaries and parameters, like I don't have time, or your goals and desires, like, hey, I want to retire in 10 years, that's going to inform where you choose to be along the effort reward spectrum. And that in turn informs the specific type of property that you are choosing, as well as the methods you use to look for that property. So in your case, for the person who sent this email, indicated that when it comes to property selection, they want something that doesn't need a lot of major repairs. So that would be down here. But they didn't give any indication as to where they wanted to be when it comes to methodology of search, right? So they didn't give any indication as to what their preference was in terms of the easiest method, which is using the MLS, versus some slightly harder, but like you get better value for your money methods. Um, and so and so if they wanted, let's say, something that was maybe a little bit more midpoint, right, along the spectrum, then maybe they buy a fixer upper, but they do it. I'm sorry. They don't buy a fixer upper. They buy something that's move in ready because that's what they said in their email, right? They buy something that's move in ready and that doesn't require any major renovations, but they do it um, by by like building out a team that includes some boots on the ground person, an agent or an assistant who uh who drives for dollars or who launches a postcard campaign or maybe they form relationships with the type of people who do that and those people pass them some of those deals, right? Those like those are some of the ways where you figure out kind of where along the spectrum you want to be, and that informs how you start to look for properties. I think zooming out a little bit, one of the big takeaways that I hope you get from what I'm talking about right now is that a lot of people, particularly if you've never bought a property in the past, a lot of people assume that publicly listed properties on the MLS, public listings, are the only way to buy a property. That's not the case at all. In fact, most professional investors, most full time investors, um, I shouldn't say most because I don't actually have statistics, but many, anecdotally speaking, the majority of the ones that I know, and many rental property investors do not use the MLS. Um, Many rental property investors, the full-time ones, the ones who make this their bread and butter, are they're looking for properties that are as yet unlisted because that's where the deals are. And you've got to think for those investors, many of those investors are flippers, right? They flip properties. Their criteria that you're looking for when you're flipping a property is not the same as the criteria that you hold when you're looking for a buy and hold property. And so a lot of the people who are searching for those types of properties for the purpose of flipping homes, they may come across some deals that would be great rentals, but not good flips. And so they might pass on that deal because they're like, this isn't a good flip, so it's not for me. But, if you form relationships with those people, then now they're doing the work anyway, and now they're sending you the deals that they found because you're playing a different game than they are, right? They're flipping, you're in buy and hold, so naturally they're going to be coming across properties that are good for you but not for them. And so that's one of the ways that like that people are able to look for properties in more creative methods. Um, and what I was about to say was particularly extroverts, but let me like kind of give that some additional context. One of the quizzes that we have inside of our course, Your First Rental Property, is this quiz called what is your, I think the title of it, the name of the quiz is something to the effect of what is your deal finding personality, or what is your deal finding style? And it's a bit of a personality assessment, um, in which you answer a series of questions to identify, are you the extrovert who loves meeting new people and maintaining relationships? And so you're really excited about the prospect of talking to some of these people who are searching for off market deals and forming relationships with them such that they pass you the deals the deals that aren't a good fit for them, right? Maybe if you're an extrovert who's very relationship driven, um, that might be perfect for you. There's some number of you who are watching this. Maybe you work in sales, or if even if you don't, you're the personality type that would work in sales, right? If that's you, then forming those relationships is probably your best bet in terms of your personality style of finding these off-market deals. By contrast, there are other people who are watching this video where you are like data people. And what you really love are spreadsheets, and you love A/B split testing and you love analytics, and you don't want to, you're not like a sales, you don't have the personality of a salesperson. You're not extroverted. You're not out there forming relationships. You really love spending time with a spreadsheet and you really love running rigorous analysis, right? And so for that personality type, something like a direct mail campaign, um, it would be a much better fit for that personality type because that's a great creative way to look for off-market deals that fits an analyst personality, right? So part of figuring out what is the best way to look for properties, particularly when it comes to off-market deals, is looking at the menu of options that are out there and then doing a personality assessment to understand which of these among this menu of options, which of these best suits my personality and my tendencies, right? Because ultimately, the best search strategy is the one that is a fit for you. Now, all of that said, that's a discussion about finding off market deals. And you may or may not want to find off market deals. Again, going back to the effort reward spectrum, if you're like, hey, look, I'm really busy and my biggest limitation is the fact that I don't have a whole lot of time. And so, what I'm optimizing for first and foremost is minimal time input. Cool. That's awesome. If you're doing that, then then buying a public listing, something that's publicly listed on the MLS with the help of a real estate agent. Um, and we'll teach you in the course how to screen real estate agents and find ones who specifically work with investors because you don't want an agent who works with retail clients or who predominantly works with retail clients. They are in a totally different headspace than the agents who work with investors. But anyway, um, if what you want is time minimization, then working with an agent who primarily works with investors um, to buy a publicly listed property that is in move-in ready condition, that's what you're aiming for. And so then the next questions that come from that are, do you want class A, class B, class C? Do you want single family versus multi-unit? And a lot of that is going to depend on um, number one, your strategy. Are you optimizing for cash flow or for appreciation? And number two, the specific geographic area that you're looking at. Because some markets are better for one versus the other. So in Indianapolis, for example, um, the duplex that I bought is in a neighborhood that is relative. It's your classic, I think, class B neighborhood. It's the type of place where Homer and Marge Simpson would live, right? It's not up. There's no Lululemon. There's no Soul Cycle. It's not that type. It's not like posh. Um, but it's still a perfectly nice. Again, the Homer and Marge Simpson is the best metaphor. It's the type of place where you would like find a Red Lobster. Um, and that particular neighborhood has a lot of duplexes. So it's very normal in that given area for people to live in duplexes, for families to live in duplexes. And so given that neighborhood, given that was the neighborhood where I was seeing really a lot of stability, there's not a lot of turnover. You have tenants who stay. The tenant that I have that's in there right now has been there, geez, I think pretty much since I bought the property. I have not replaced. I have not had to do a tenant turnover. Um, since I bought it, when I bought it, there was an initial turnover in the first month or two after I bought it. Nothing since then. So, um, you know, but I was aiming for that. And the reason I was aiming for that is because I decided that I wanted to optimize um, for a class B neighborhood that was going to probably have good cash flow, but the appreciation in that neighborhood might not be as good as other neighborhoods in the Indianapolis area. And that was fine because the strategy that I was undertaking was centered more around cash flow than it is around equity growth or appreciation. That might not be true for you, right? So each investor is going to come to this with a different set of goals, and it might be the case that for you, you're angling for equity growth and appreciation. Maybe you mentioned in your email that you don't have any desire to retire anytime in the near future. So maybe for you, cash flow isn't important. Maybe for you, what's important is having a really good net worth statement when you, 30 years from now, right? When you turn on your 60th birthday, you want to look at all of the equity that you've built in real estate and be like, wow, this is something, right? And if that's what you're aiming for, then you're going to be choosing neighborhoods and potentially even choosing cities or locations that are more optimized for equity growth, even if the cash flow isn't quite there. Um, and it should still be positive cash flow, but it just might not be as good of cash flow if what you're if what you're optimizing for is an equity play. So all of that goes into first deciding what type of property you want, and then once you've decided that, that informs the city that you go for, the class A, B, C that you select, whether you're going for a single family home versus a multi-unit. It informs all of those downstream decisions. So I hope that helped in giving you a framework for understanding uh, how to look for a rental property. And again, if you don't mind my like terrible handwriting and drawing, the effort reward spectrum, right? As effort increases, reward increases. If you're somebody who wants to maximize profits, um, then that's good to know, but it's going to take a lot more work. If you're somebody who wants to minimize time, you can absolutely do that, but you're not going to be making as much as the person who's putting in a bunch of work, extra work. That's pretty much just how it goes. Cool. Well, thank you for the question. Um, all right, we have another question from somebody who says, we have young adult children who are interested in getting their first rental properties, but the current environment is intimidating. Um, that is, and I'm just gonna jot down the timestamp right here so I can send it to them after this. Um, so the current environment is intimidating. I assume, and I don't know exactly what you mean by current environment, but I'm going to assume that you're referring to the fact that interest rates are so freaking high. And so the first thing I want to say is I get it. Like this is a very I can sit here and tell you that current interest rates are, oh, if you zoom out and you look at the last, 100 years worth of data, um, current interest rates are historically normal. That's true. That's absolutely true. But it's also very little consolation when when we have that recency bias that comes from having gotten so used to living in the ZIRP era, the zero interest rate policy era. Um, there's a difference between the emotional experienced truth of a person's lived reality versus what historic historic facts say. And you're talking about, the people who sent this email have young adult children, so you may remember the early 80s. In the early 80s, interest rates were double digits. So we back in the early 80s, back in the late 70s, early 80s, we saw some very, very high interest rates. And again, if you think back to the early 2000s, it was common in the early 2000s to pay 6% interest rates, even 7% interest rates on properties. That was as recently as 20 years ago. That was the case. But it's also true that if what you're used to, you mentioned that these are young adult children, what they've grown up seeing are 2%, 3%, 4% interest rates. That's an interest rate era that we're unlikely to get back, at least not anytime soon. And so if what you grew up seeing was that, then it can be a bit of a hard pill to swallow to recognize, like, hey, interest rates right now are at 7%. And yes, in a long-term historic context, that's normal. But in this over the span of the last 15 years, which is what many young adults have primarily remember in the span of the last 15 years, that feels really high. So, um, so what do you do about it? Well, for any real estate dilemma, you look to a spreadsheet. You know, ultimately, the way to overcome some of the emotional impacts of, you know, we talked about like recency bias. Recency bias is a cognitive bias in which we tend to overweight the importance of things that have happened recently because those things are most salient. And uh, converse, conversely, or in turn, we also tend to discount the importance of things that happened too far in the past because they aren't as salient, they don't as easily come to mind. So that's another. It's a related cognitive bias known as the availability heuristic. Those don't as readily come to mind, and therefore we tend to discount the magnitude or the importance of these. And so, how do you overcome your cognitive biases, and how do you overcome kind of the emotional impact of like, oh, I feel overwhelmed by these interest rates? How do you overcome all of that? The spreadsheet, right? The spreadsheet is where you kind of get rid of the cognitive biases, you get rid of the emotional impact, and you just take a look at the numbers, a cold, hard look at the numbers. And so we have a very robust spreadsheet inside of our course, Your First Rental Property, in which we go through um, all of, you know, with painstaking detail. Um, Here's the purchase price. Here's the down payment. Here's the interest rate. Are you going to buy down points on the mortgage? And if so, are you going to wrap that into the loan? Um, you know, here's the cost of upfront repairs needed to get this rent ready for the first tenant. Here are my assumptions about what the ongoing cost of capital expenditures is going to be, what the ongoing cost of repairs, maintenance, property management is going to be. Here are my assumptions around vacancy. Based on all of that, let's take a look at the wealth creation of this property. And let's take a look at it in year 1, year 2, year 3, all the way to year 15. And that's going to be a function of um, not just the cash flow, but here's the equity growth through principal paydown. Here's the equity growth through debt payoff acceleration if you choose to do that. Here is equity growth through forced appreciation, so any improvements made to the property. Here is equity growth through, um, you know, one advantage that people have right now is that homes are appreciating, at least in the last several years. Homes have appreciated at a much more rapid rate than they historically ever have. Historically, over the long term, homes nationwide tend to appreciate at about a 5% rate. Now, again, that is a broad nationwide average, and what's true in Seattle is going to be different than what's true in Youngstown, Ohio. So, your specific location, your particular locality could differ greatly, but as a very broad nationwide average, over the long term, homes have gone up by about 5%. But in the last few years, homes have accelerated at a rate that's significantly beyond that. Particularly 2020 to 2021, we saw 17% growth in homes nationwide just in that 1 year alone. Um, and there's some markets. You look at Miami. There was a interview that I watched earlier today on Bloomberg TV, where someone was talking about Florida in general goes through these boom bust cycles, but overall the trajectory tends to go upwards. So you have a condo that was his. I'm quoting him or paraphrasing him. He said you have a condo. It was 4 million, and then it goes up to 10 million, and now it's 8 million, but so it's not quite the 10 that it used to be, but it's still much higher than the 4 million that it cost just a few years ago. So anyway, all of that to say, yes, it's true that interest rates are a lot higher, but in many markets, and again, this could vary a lot depending on your specific location, but in many markets, properties are also appreciating at in many markets at similar rates. So yes, there are 7% interest rates right now on mortgages, but you also have properties that are rising at in some cases, 7%. So that's one element of it. That being said, however, at the end of the day, so when I going back to the spreadsheet, at the end of the day, what matters is, does this property have an attractive cap rate? And is that cap rate attractive enough that it justifies the interest rate that I would pay for the debt servicing on the property? Not just the cap rate, but the total return. So let's say that you have a property that has a cap rate of, we'll say, 5.5% or 6%. There's an alumni of our course. His name is Deepak. You can watch our interview with him. Go to affordanything.com/enroll. Click on the link at the top navigation bar that says Student Stories. You'll see interviews with a lot of our alumni. You click on Deepak, go to about the 4-minute and 50-second timestamp of that video, and he talks about how his properties, he took like the easy approach because he didn't have a lot of time, and he got properties that had about a 5.5 to 6% cap rate, right? Now, your cap rate is your dividend stream. It's the unleveraged dividend that comes from the property. It's not the total return. The total return is the cap rate plus the rate of appreciation. So let's say that you're buying a property that has, we'll use the lower of the two numbers. You're buying a property that has a 5.5% cap rate, and it's in an area where you reasonably expect, or analysts expect, that area to rise, the real estate values in that area to rise by another 5% year over year, right? And historically, homes within that area, let's say, have risen 5% year over year, right? So 5.5% cap rate plus 5% rate of appreciation, we're talking about an 11.5% unleveraged rate of return. Now, that's not cash on cash return, which I think is kind of, there are some issues with the cash on cash return formula. If you calculated cash on cash return, it would actually be much, much higher than 11%. But I think there's some issues with the formula that we can go through later. Forgetting the cash on cash return formula and looking only at the unleveraged total return, the cap rate plus the rate of capital appreciation, right? We're talking about a property that has an 11% in this example, a nearly 11%, 10.5% total return unleveraged, right? And so if you're taking out a mortgage at 7% to get a property that's producing returns at 10.5%, I mean, you could arbitrage that deal all day, assuming it's cash flow positive, right? Because that spread is there, and that spread is quite good. So that's what I would look at, and that's what I mean by turning to the spreadsheet for your answers, because ultimately the spreadsheet is going to show you whether or not the property has attractive enough returns to be able to justify taking out a loan at 7%. So that's the advice that I would give to your young adult children: is use a very, very robust spreadsheet and use, solid formulas where you're looking at the cap rate, you're looking at the net present value, you're calculating the internal rate of return, right? Look at all of that to determine whether or not it's worth taking out a loan at 7% in order to get the return, in order to finance the returns that you're after. Because you want to make sure that there's a wide enough spread between what you're paying for the loan and the returns that you are likely to receive. So that would be my recommendation. All right, let's answer one more question. Let's go with, okay. So this person says, I've been casually looking at real estate to perhaps have a permanent home for my son, but I'm not sure if I can keep up with all the details of buying and managing a property. Well, the part of what we offer with our course, Your First Rental Property, is, when it comes to those details, what you need, rather than like an ad hoc, fly by the seat of your pants approach, which is what a lot of, myself included, beginner real estate investors did or do. Like, I basically built this course to give myself the systems and the structure that I would have wanted in my first year or first 2 years. Because my first 2 years, I was flying by the seat of my pants. I had receipts scattered everywhere. Stuff was inputted into, there was no good organizational systems. Um, it was very, very like make it up as I go along, fly by the seat of my pants. And that is not a good system. And so what we did was when we built the course, we were like, all right, here are the checklists, here are the spreadsheets, here's a flow chart. Here, if you need to make a call to a contractor or a property manager, here's a word for word script that you can use when you talk on the phone. Here's text that you can copy paste to put into emails if you're emailing an agent or a property manager. Here is the entire system for you. Take it, use it. And that way you have an organizational structure, because what you need is that structure to keep you organized, so that way, because otherwise it can be really haphazard. And that's one of the difficulties. It's one of the challenges when you are just trying to go at it alone, or when you're trying to like make it up as you go along. So, so I would encourage you to have that system and that structure in place, and that's what we offer through your first rental properties, those checklists and the spreadsheets and just everything to keep you organized. Now, in your email, you also say that you're not good with numbers, and first that's I would encourage you to question that assumption, because that's a very limiting belief. A lot of us, you know, internalize this limitation that we might have been taught in early childhood. Oh, I'm not good with numbers. Oh, I'm not good with money. Um, but a growth mindset. And there's a psychologist by the name of Carol Dweck who has done a lot. She's a Stanford psychologist, a Stanford researcher who has done a lot of research around growth mindset. And she now has mentored a team of proteges, Dr. David Yeager at the University of Texas, Austin, Dr. Mary Murphy, who's also at Stanford as well as Indiana University. I have her book. That's her book right there, Cultures of Growth, sitting behind me. Um, she has influenced a whole team of other psychologists who have done this research in the field of growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset. And so fixed mindset is I'm not good with numbers. Growth mindset is I'm getting better with numbers. Every single day, I am trying. I am working on it. I have support. I have accountability. I have teachers, and I am getting better at numbers every day, right? That is growth mindset. And that's what I would really encourage you to internalize, because that kind of growth mindset, that kind of growth thinking allows you to overcome your limitations, your internalized sense of limitation, and allows you to one day wake up and be like, you know what? I am good with numbers. But that very few people are born good with numbers, right? It comes from believing that you are getting better at numbers every day. And the more that you do that, the more confidence that you build in that. That's also, by the way, why we offer so much support. We have study halls where students get together and work on homework assignments as a cohort with their peers, with one another, because that kind of support, and that we have TAs, teachers assistants, who are alumni of the course, who shepherd the new cohort of students through it. And that's because having that kind of peer support, having that kind of accountability can really help you get better with numbers, right? Particularly when you have the support of others, when you have the support of students, of your fellow students and alumni who've walked in those shoes and who've been through the course and who've done it. So, all right. So those are 3 questions that came from our VIP list. Hello to those of us who are joining live. Merck was here. Hello. So thank you so much for all those of you joining live. Thank you to all of you who are on the VIP list. Again, if you are not yet on the VIP list, you can join at affordanything.com/VIP list. Email us your questions. I am reading through all of them and will answer them piece by piece in these live streams that I'm doing. So thank you again, and happy Mother's Day. Have a great Sunday. All right, take care.